Yes, as you see, my name is Professor B. Scherer. I'm the director of Social Justice Research Institute at Canterbury Christchurch University, called INCISE. From my background, I'm a professor in gender studies and religious studies. And today I want to, by way of introducing this panel on queer religion, think a little bit through queer and religion and how they can or not dialogue. Starting with queer theory, it has long been acknowledged that the term queer implies, quote, dissident defiance of dominant meanings of sex and gender. Among the loci classici for approaching the term, one of the most famous is by Eve Kosowsko-Sedgwick, who speaks of the open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning when constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically. 15 years ago, Jonathan Kemp succinctly observed that queer, if it names anything, names a critical impulse that can, never, must, never settle. Consequently, queer theory can never attain a single stable intellectual stance, but needs to utilize a diverse and often conflicting set of interdisciplinary approaches to desire, subjectivity, identity, relationality, ethnicity, and norms. This intellectual instability might be queer theory's most significant problem. Defying sexuality and gender normativities necessarily connects with other indissolubly interlaced, marginalized normativities such as ethnicity, colonial, post-colonial, decolonial, and subaltern status and able-bodiness, just to mention a few. The subversion of normativities, resistance, becomes a much broader social justice issue. Intersectional theory is born, if not by name, then by practice. Has then intersectional theory emptied queer of any remaining common focus? Some queer theorists caution openly against the loss of, quote, queer's radical force if its semantic range is extended to encompass concepts and experiences which are not shared by the sexually non-normative regardless of location. Ko, I'm quoting you from the introduction of QP3. And they plead to keep queer queer. And what happens if any given intersecting societal paradigm has successfully been queered, challenged, and dismantled? But post-queer yearning, meaning, and belonging struggles to emerge in the allegedly unavoidable ethical vacuum, which the dominant religious discourses gloomily foreshadow for the case that their hegemonic or self-declared morally superior essentializing codes of social interactions are troubled, subverted, and voided. The prophesied post-religious crisis of queer mirrors the equally prophesied postmodern crisis of religion and its academic study. After the post-structuralist and post-essentialist turn, religious studies itself has been subjected to increased meta-reflection and contestation. Acknowledging its very subject, religion, as both non-definable and as a Eurocentric colonialist imposition, religious studies is struggling with both methodological aporia and the loss of its subject. At the same time, the global north or northwest, here, a crisis of religious institutions due to secularization and the loss of credibility of organized religions has been noted. Closer attention has been paid to individualized forms of religious experience and to the rise of subjective alternative spirituality. Yet, in the last decades, the increasing challenges to modernisms as the dominant Western or colonial mindset and the comeback of organized religion have been noted as a post-secular turn in cultures and societies. are organized religions as forms as vestigial governmentality, proving resilient due to their offer of binary structures of thinking and belonging, allied to and mirrored by an hierarchical binarism which underlies heteropatriarchal power and authority? For LGBTIQ plus subjectivities, a societal resonance of religion can constitute a challenge. In Lacanian terms, heteropatriarchal power is symbolized by having the phallus. You can think about this picture how you want it, but I just put in phallus here. Hegemonic and oppressive cis or hetero male privilege. This privilege is based on an essentialist gender binary and produces sexism as the expression of hegemonic power. Homo and biphobia, lesbophobia, biphobia, as the expression of phallic insecurity. And in its most violent form, it creates transphobia. The very existence of trans people is perceived as an attack on the foundations of the phallus, which is the alleged inalterability of essentialized, hierarchical, and strictly binarist gender. Recently, I have started to theorize all these various expressions and modes of heterosexist oppression under the term Phallophobia, the fear of losing the Lacanian phallus, or the privileged binarist gender power. Analogously, most religious organizations and institutions claim, hold, and in post and counter-secular contexts reclaim the spiritual phallus along the true-false dichotomy of European classical logics. Challenging the spiritual phallus, LGBTIQ plus people are often becoming the prime targets of religious hatred. When exhibiting the spiritual phallus, religious organizations and institutions are availing themselves of the aid of a romantic myth that any religion is worthy of special respect and protection. This myth is summarized in the truism, all religions are good, or all religions want peace and happiness for all. These post- and counter-secularly popular assertions have two interconnected and major consequences. Firstly, if all religions are essentially good, it follows that any expression of a religion not justifiably billed as good has to be an abuse or a misuse of religion. Secondly, if all those good religions have proper ethicality, peace and happiness for all in their mind, then any religious conviction should have equal or even higher value and legal protection to, or than, other characteristics of legal identity politics. Obviously, it is not difficult to critically argue that religions per se cannot essentially be classified as good, nor as bad. Evidently, religions simply are. They are there. Hence, there simply is no misuse, no abuse of religion. Violence and oppression in the name of any religion are simply that, expressions of religion. Value neutral in their potential state, religions are morally protean in actualization. Accepting this needs to result into a rethinking of the protective privileges claimed by faith or religion as an identitarian characteristic. If religion is itself an intrinsically value-neutral category, having a harmful or a discriminatory religious conviction or practice cannot be seen as equally worthy of protection as identifying with and or expression a sexual orientation and or gender identity. In legal terms, constitutional rights warranting the free practice of a religion cannot be conflated with or treated as an unlimited human right of equal or higher hierarchy to or than individual human rights to, e.g., the right to physical integrity. I argue indeed that individual bodily integrity should be used as a primary principle in the hierarchy of rights. While fully acknowledging the identitarian messiness of human existence employing bodily integrity as a critical parameter enables us to successfully challenge harmful embodied religious discourses. When evaluating ethical practices and privileges, an embodied well-being focus approach would weigh heavily in discussions about cultural practices. Yet some queer theorists and post-colonial feminists alike have maneuvered themselves into the very dilemma of ethical relativizing silence with regard to harmful cultural and religious practices, e.g. to avoid the charge of homo-nationalism. This silent complicity with evident heteropatriarchal oppression appears to mistake post-colonial agency, which for many reasons can be complicit with oppression, with informed individual empowerment to claim freedom of suffering. At the other hand, seeing culture and religion as value neutral per se and morally protein and expression does not preclude us a priori from taking serious religious discourses as inscribed on religious bodies. The ethical discourse around the vulnerable or wounded body simply shifts from essentialized arguments based on religion as a protective good in itself to the question where individual bodily self-expression becomes a question of societal concern. Hence, for example, the question of religious circumcision becomes part of the same discourse negotiating or non-negotiating the governance or non-governance of, for example, suicide, extreme BDSM, and euthanasia. Value-neutral evaluation of religion and faith also allows us to challenge another binary in a form of dualistic construction of queer versus religion. The idea that bad religion is persecuting good queers. We have to challenge here the myth of the good religion balanced by challenging the myth of the per se ethical superiority of any member of any marginalized group. In other words, being a victim doesn't make you a saint. Being a victim of phallophobia, sexism, homo, lesbo, biphobia, transphobia, does not render anyone to be morally superior. Hence, with all the queering, troubling, and subverting, it might be worth to ask the question of the possibility of post-queer ethics or ethics after queering. Now, the recent decades and years have seen an increasing academic interest in the spiritual needs, expressions, and practices of queer subjects themselves. And while queer spiritual yearnings and needs spawn some queer including, queer embracing religious practices in the contemporary societal discourses on human rights, in particular in the global Northwest, religious rights and LGBTIQ rights are still constructed as oppositional. This enmity is aided by the idiosyncrasy of identity politics, which attributes an implicit value to different characteristics and affords religious convictions a priori protection, even when those convictions are harmfully discriminatory. For example, in North America, religious, here conservative, queerophobic Christian cultural codes form vestigial governmental structures by re-erecting the spiritual phallus. In this way, they play an important part of queerophobic oppression and soul murder. LGBTIQ Christians are hence viewed as suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome means that you are being kidnapped, and you become converted to those who have kidnapped you and oppress you. So that is basically what it means in psychology. I propose calling the particular form of homonormativity which constructs itself in opposition to religion and faith homosecularism. In consequence of counter-Christian homosexualism, queer Christians, theologians and religionists are left in an uncomfortable position to justify their allegiance to or interest in, per se, anti-LGBTIQ religion. Once the freedom to practice a religion cannot be construed to imply the freedom to discriminate against the religiously abject or other, the allegedly essential oppositionality of queer identities and religions might be bridged. This can be done by thinking about and asserting spiritual needs and rights for queer subjects. The ensuing dynamic can lead to the creation of inclusive spiritual places. It expresses itself in multiple ways as creating new queer spiritual spaces or claiming a queer space, even in queerophobic religious contexts, and by doing so, subverting queerophobic institutions. As heightening queer spiritual visibility as another example, or as another expression, as queer appropriation of religious modernism, science, rationalism, discourse, and postmodern spiritualities. Queer pragmatism can mean supporting those theologies which open up institutional religious discourses. Queer spiritual re-empowerment consists of jouissant reclaiming of religious agency for informed individual empowerment. The onus falls on any organized religion in the focus of critique to do some honest soul and phallus searching in regards to the past and the present religious oppression and violence, without trying to deflect blame or obscure the past. The trust of LGBTIQ subjects embroidered into the dichotomist discourse of queer rights versus religion can only be advanced by sincere steps towards, in Christian theological terms, repent, which is different than saying sorry, and steps to reform on the side of religious institutions and organizations. This is exactly the demand that was made on the 7th January 2016 by 105 senior 205 senior Anglicans from the Anglican Communion, gathering in Canterbury. Yet to no avail. On the contrary, the Anglican Communion appears to have reverted to a firm anti-queer stance by punishing the US Episcopal Church over, quote, its stance on same-sex marriage and homosexuality. Queer religious relations can be approved above all by firmly basing religious practices on the human principle. The principle which puts the embodied person above any abstract doctrine and establishes concrete compassion and love in action above abstract ideas. Any such dialogue also asks from queer subjects to themselves their compassion and forgiveness. Despite any potential residual spiritual wounds queer people might individually or collectively bear. In that way, an empowered spiritual choice can become the instrument to healing. Within this process, the re-spiritualization of queerness becomes part of a queer resistance to neoliberal homonormativity, which expresses itself in late capitalist, consumerist, and also hedonistic homosecularism. Moving beyond these alignments, it appears to me that a successful queer re-spiritualization will need to be preceded by individual value shifts from materialist egotism to living a post-moral, in Foucauldian terms, or post-queer ethics of embodied compassion in action and in activism. A queer thought, spiritual and or religious identity can naturally draw meaning and jouissance from a spiritual awakening, again a Christian term, which aims at and performs an empowered queer spiritual embodiment. For me, claiming the responsibility for this empowerment naturally results in an urgent social activist impulse, the queering of religious paradigms. Thank you very much.